The gun was already pressed to Paul Weston's temple when Susanna Hadley finally understood what keeping his secret had cost her. Sheriff Dale Harrow stood in the center of the Dustfall General Store with his badge catching the dying afternoon light and his revolver steady as stone against Paul's skull. Paul's hands were raised, his jaw set in that quiet, unreadable way she had come to know as his particular brand of courage, the kind that didn't announce itself. His dark eyes found hers across the crowded room, and what she saw there wasn't fear. It was apology. "Miss Hadley," Harrow said without turning to look at her, "I'm going to ask you one time and you're going to tell me the truth, because if you lie to me again I will know it. Was this man in your barn on the night of April 12th? The whole town of Dustfall, New Mexico Territory, was watching her. 14 witnesses packed into a general store on a Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1883, waiting to see what a schoolteacher from Ohio would do when the law finally caught up with the outlaw she'd been hiding. She had kept Paul Weston's secret for 6 weeks, 4 days, and approximately 11 hours. She had kept it through blizzards and bar fights, and the kind of loneliness that settles into a person's bones in the high desert. She had kept it through threats and tears and moments in the dark of her barn when she had looked at this man and felt something so forbidden and so true that she'd been afraid to name it even in her private thoughts. She had kept it because he asked her to. And then she had kept it because she wanted to. And somewhere in the space between those two reasons, everything had changed. She looked at Paul Weston now, with the barrel of a gun against his head and his eyes steady on hers, and she realized with the clarity of a woman standing at the edge of her own life that she didn't need to keep his secret anymore. Not because she had decided to betray him, but because he had already stopped being what she was hiding. She opened her mouth, and the truth that came out was not what Sheriff Harrow was expecting, and it was not what Paul Weston was expecting either, and it changed every single thing about the remainder of both of their lives. But to understand why, you have to go back to the night of April 12th. The storm came in fast the way New Mexico storms always did, without warning or apology, the kind that turned the sky the color of a bruise and made the high desert smell of iron and rain. Susanna Hadley had been in Dustfall for exactly 7 months when that storm hit, and in those 7 months she had learned 3 things. The wind could strip paint off a door in a single night. The men at the Silver Tongue Saloon would argue about anything including the proper way to nail a horseshoe, and loneliness was its own kind of weather. She had come west from Columbus, Ohio, in the fall of 1882, 24 years old and holding a teaching certificate and the particular brand of stubbornness that her mother had called determination and her father had called foolishness. The Dustfall schoolhouse had needed a teacher after its previous one left in the summer, and Susanna had needed something she couldn't name precisely but felt in her chest like a door that hadn't been opened yet. The town was small. 200 souls pressed against the edge of the Sangre de Cristo foothills, a main street with a saloon and a general store, and a land office, and a church that doubled as a courthouse when the circuit judge came through. There was a livery stable run by an old Mexican man named Hector Vega who kept to himself and knew more than he said. There was a hotel that smelled of pipe tobacco and old wool. There were families and cattle ranchers and a few prospectors who still believed in silver despite the evidence. And there was the Hadley farm, which was not called the Hadley farm by anyone in town because Susanna's arrangement was a rental from the Dobbins family who had moved to Santa Fe, but she had claimed it in her heart the way a woman alone in a wide country claims any space that is hers. A small house, a barn, a kitchen garden, 12 acres of scrubby land at the edge of town. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. She had been bolting the barn door against the April storm when she heard him, not words, just breath. The particular sound of a person trying very hard not to be heard, which is its own kind of sound. Susanna was not a timid woman. She had grown up with 2 brothers and a father who believed that fear was a choice you made once and regretted twice. She did not run. She did not scream. She picked up the pitchfork that leaned against the barn wall and she said, "I know you're in there. Come out or I'll make you come out." A long pause, the storm pushing against the barn boards, the horses shifting in their stalls. Then from the far corner behind the hay, a man unfolded himself from the dark. He was tall. That was the first thing. Taller than the average man by a noticeable measure, lean in the way of someone who had missed meals with some regularity, and dressed in trail clothes that had seen considerable use. His hat was dark with rain. His coat was a long canvas duster, mud-hemmed. His face, when he turned it toward the lantern light, was the kind of face that made you look twice, not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it was complicated. Sharp jaw, dark eyes set deep, a mouth that seemed to be holding something back. He had been shot. That much was obvious from the way he held his left side, the coat dark and wet in a way that wasn't rain. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. His voice was low and steady, and she would learn later that it was always like that, steady, regardless of circumstances. It was simply how he was made. "I just need to get out of the rain." "You're bleeding," she said. "Yes." "How bad?" He considered this with the kind of honesty she would come to appreciate enormously. "Bad enough that I'd prefer not to stand here much longer." His name she did not know yet. What she knew was that he was hurt and that the storm was worsening, and that there was a basic human arithmetic that even a cautious woman from Ohio could not ignore. She set the pitchfork against the wall. She said, "Sit down before you fall down," and she went to the house for her medicine tin. She had learned some frontier medicine in her months in Dustfall. Mrs. Clara Whitmore, who ran the boarding house on Elm Street and had been a midwife for 30 years, had taught her how to clean a wound with whiskey and close it with silk thread, and when to be afraid and when not to be. The bullet had gone through the meat of his side below the ribs, clean enough, no organs touched as far as she could tell. She cleaned it by lamplight in the barn while the storm shook the walls and he sat on a hay bale and did not make a sound. "Most men make a sound," she said, concentrating on the thread. "I've had worse," he said. "That's not a compliment to yourself." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the preliminary architecture of one. "No, I suppose it isn't." She tied off the last stitch and sat back on her heels. "What's your name?" He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern threw warm shadows across his face. Outside, the thunder moved through the mountains like something enormous changing its mind. "Paul," he said. "Paul Weston." She knew the name. Not personally. She knew it the way everyone in the territory knew it, from newspapers and from the particular hum of dangerous gossip that traveled through a place like Dustfall the way electricity traveled through a wire. Paul Weston, the man who had ridden with the Calhoun gang 3 years ago. The man the Pinkerton agency had been looking for in connection with the robbery of the Abilene rail payroll. The man the territorial marshal's office had offered $200 for, dead or returned, and who had allegedly shot a man in a card game in Taos the previous fall, though that last part had 3 different versions depending on who told it. An outlaw, wanted, dangerous, sitting in her barn with her stitches in his side and his hat in his hands and his dark eyes watching her with an expression that was, if she was being precise about it, something like shame. She should have felt afraid. She told herself she felt afraid. But what she actually felt was something more complicated and considerably less safe, which was the dawning suspicion that the story she thought she knew about this man and the man sitting in front of her were not precisely the same story. "You know who I am," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Then you know what the sensible thing for you to do is." "The sensible thing would have been not to let you in," she said. "I seem to have gotten past that." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that you have every right to say no." "Ask." "I need a place to stay for a few days, until I can ride. I need you to not tell anyone I'm here." He paused. "I know what I'm asking. I know what it means for you if you're found to be harboring me. I'm not asking lightly." Susanna Hadley looked at this man, this wounded outlaw in her barn, and she thought about the cost of what he was asking. She thought about her teaching position and her rental arrangement, and the fragile credibility she had built in 7 months of hard work in a town that had not initially been entirely welcoming to a woman from Ohio who came without a husband and without family, and without any obvious reason for being there other than her own stubborn ambition. She thought about all of that. And then she thought about the way he had said, "I know what I'm asking," with the particular weight of a man who understood consequence and was asking anyway, not out of desperation alone, but because she was the only person he had, and sometimes the world narrows down to one door and you knock. 3 days, she said. You can stay in the barn. You don't come to the house unless I invite you. You leave as soon as you can ride safely, and you tell me the truth about what happened to you. He met her eyes. Which part of the truth do you want? All of it, she said. I'll decide what's relevant. He told her that night quietly while the storm ran its course above the barn roof. He had ridden with Calhoun's gang, yes. That part was true. He was 22 years old and newly arrived from Tennessee, and he had been stupid and hungry and angry in the specific way of a young man who had lost his father to a war and his mother to cholera, and who did not yet understand that the direction of your anger matters more than its intensity. He had ridden with Calhoun for 8 months. He had been present at the Abilene robbery. He had not fired a weapon during it, but he had been there, which was enough. What had made him leave was a man named Denton Fales, who was Calhoun's second in command, and who had shot a store clerk in Wichita not for resistance but for slowness. Paul had watched that, and something had broken open in him, the last false wall between who he had been telling himself he was and what he was actually participating in. He had left that same night, ridden south, spent 3 years doing honest work on cattle ranches and in mine operations across New Mexico and Colorado, trying to build enough distance between himself and those 8 months that they would stop defining him. He was 30 years old now. The Pinkerton men had found him in Santa Fe 2 weeks ago. Someone had talked, someone who knew his face and knew the reward money, and he had run because he did not trust that the law's version of justice and actual justice were the same thing, which Susanna could not honestly argue with given what she knew of territorial courts in 1883. He had been trying to get to a man in Albuquerque, a lawyer named Carver, who had corresponded with him about the possibility of voluntary surrender in exchange for testimony against Calhoun, who was still operating and still violent. The Pinkerton man who had found him in Santa Fe had shot him before he could explain any of that. Susanna listened to all of it. She had a good listener's quality of stillness, the kind that made people feel heard rather than merely tolerated, and she used it now not as a technique but because she was genuinely, entirely absorbed. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. "The lawyer in Albuquerque," she said. "You have his name and address. In my coat pocket. Then that's where you're going when you can ride. And until then you're staying in my barn, and I'm going to bring you food and check those stitches, and you're going to keep very quiet." Paul Weston looked at her across the lamplight with an expression that she would return to in memory many times in the weeks that followed, trying to identify it precisely. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was in it. It was something more surprise than gratitude, as though she had done something he had not known to expect from the world and was recalibrating accordingly. "Why?" he asked. She considered the question seriously. "Because the law being after you and you deserving to be caught are not necessarily the same thing, and because I'm not in the habit of deciding a man's worth based on his worst 8 months. She went to the house. She did not sleep much that night. The 3 days became 5 days, became 10 days. His wound mended faster than expected, partly because he was strong and partly because the desert air was clean, and partly because she was a better nurse than either of them had anticipated. But riding required more than a healed wound. It required that the 2 Pinkerton men who had come through Dustfall on the 14th of April, asking questions, had truly moved on, and that the territorial deputy who had ridden through on the 17th had truly been satisfied with his inspection, and that the road south to Albuquerque was safe enough that a man with Pinkerton men behind him could make it in one piece. In the meantime, there was the barn. And there were the conversations. They began practically. She brought him food in the mornings before school and in the evenings after, hardtack and dried beans and whatever she could cook without it seeming like she was cooking for two, and they talked about the logistics of his situation, the lawyer, the route south, the testimony he planned to give. She had opinions about all of it. She was not a woman who withheld opinions on the grounds that they hadn't been asked for, and he discovered this quickly and seemed not to mind it at all. By the end of the first week, the conversations had broadened. They talked about Tennessee, which he had left at 17 and could not go back to because the only family he had left there was a sister named Me who had married a man in Nashville, and with whom his connection had been severed for reasons that clearly pained him, though he did not go into detail. They talked about Ohio, which she had left because Columbus felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small, the shape of another life pressing in on hers. They talked about what it meant to want something different from what the world had prepared you to want. She told him about her students. There were 14 of them ranging in age from 6 to 15, the children of ranchers and storekeepers, and the Mexican families who had been in the territory for generations before the American settlers arrived, and she loved them with the fierce, specific love of a teacher who has found her actual calling. She told him about Maria Vega, who was Hector's granddaughter and the brightest student she had ever taught, and how she was working to convince Maria's father to let her continue schooling past the age when most girls in Dustfall stopped. She told him about the way the late afternoon light came through the schoolhouse windows and turned the room gold, and how in those moments she felt she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Paul listened the way she had listened to him, with complete attention, as though what she was saying mattered in the way that real things matter, not as small talk or courtesy, but as information about a person he wanted to understand. "You love it here," he said one evening, and it was not a question. "I didn't expect to," she admitted. "I thought I'd give it a year and see, and now I can't imagine leaving." "What made you stay?" She thought about it. "The sky," she said, "and the students. And the feeling that there's room here to be something still becoming. In Columbus, I already knew exactly who I was going to be." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been moving so long I've forgotten what it feels like to be somewhere." She looked at him. The evening light was doing something extraordinary to the barn interior, the gold of it layered over the hay smell and the horse smell and the warm animal sounds of the place. He was sitting with his back against the barn wall and his long legs stretched out and his face in profile. And she thought that he looked tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, the tiredness of a person who has been carrying something for a very long time. "You could stop moving," she said. She did not mean it the way it sounded when it came out, or perhaps she did, and the recognition of what she meant frightened her enough that she looked away quickly. He didn't say anything, but she felt his gaze on the side of her face for a long moment before he looked away too. The secret was not complicated in its structure. She had simply not told anyone he was there. The difficulty was in the maintenance of that silence, which required a particular ongoing effort in a small town where people noticed everything, and where Susanna's position as schoolteacher made her a public figure in ways she had not fully anticipated when she took the job. She was watched in the comfortable way of a community watching someone it has claimed, with affection and attention, and the low-grade surveillance of people who care what you do because you matter to them. Mrs. Clara Whitmore noticed that she had been buying more cornmeal than usual. She made a comment about it at the general store, and Susanna said she had taken to baking more since the weather turned cold, which was not entirely untrue. The Reverend Marsh asked if she was well because she seemed distracted on Sunday, and she said she was working through a lesson plan, which was true enough. Deputy Saul Brecker, who handled Dustfall's law enforcement needs, while Sheriff Harrow operated from the county seat in Mesilla, nodded at her from across the street one morning, and she nodded back and kept walking, and did not let her face do anything it wasn't supposed to do. The Pinkerton men came back on the 22nd of April. There were two of them, both city-dressed in a way that announced itself in a cattle town. A man named Price who was heavy-set and flat-eyed, and a younger man whose name she never learned who kept his hand near his holster in the performative way of someone who wanted to be noticed. Price came to the schoolhouse at midday while her students were eating their lunches, and he stood in the doorway with his credentials and his flat eyes, and asked her if she had seen a man matching Paul Weston's description in the past 2 weeks. She said no with a face she had been practicing for a week. He looked at her for a longer moment than was comfortable. Then he thanked her and left. She did not go to the barn that evening. She sat in her kitchen and gripped the edge of the table, and thought about what she was doing with the full clarity of a woman who had never once in her life done something she was not prepared to defend in daylight. She thought about the law and about justice, and about the difference between them. She thought about the Abilene robbery and the store clerk in Wichita and the 8 months of terrible decisions, and the 3 years of trying to build something better. She thought about Paul Weston's voice when he talked about that clerk, the weight of it hadn't left him, the way he carried it not as excuse, but as evidence of what he had been and what he had chosen to stop being. She went to the barn the next morning before school. The Pinkerton men came back, she said. He was already sitting up. He had good instincts, she had noticed, the kind of alertness that never fully switched off. I know. I heard them ride through. They came to the school, something sharpened in his expression. Did they question you? Yes. What did you say? I said I hadn't seen you. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light came in through the barn gaps in long slanted bars. A sparrow was doing something complicated near the rafters. Susanna, he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the miss before it, and the sound of it did something irreversible to the air between them. You understand what you're risking. I understand what you're trying to do, she said. Get to Albuquerque, testify against Calhoun, clear enough of your name to live without running. That's worth risking. Not for you to risk on my behalf. I decide what's worth risking on my behalf, she said with the particular sharpness she reserved for statements that were not up for debate. I'm not a woman who makes decisions accidentally. He didn't argue, but he looked at her as though she had said something that required considerable quiet to absorb. She was halfway to the barn door when he said her name again. She stopped. I'll be able to ride in 3 more days, he said. I won't stay longer than I have to. She nodded without turning around, because her face was doing something she wasn't prepared for him to see. 3 more days. The words settled into her chest with the weight of a door closing. She had known this was temporary. She had built no story in which it was otherwise. Paul Weston was passing through, and she had given him shelter, and in the natural order of things he would leave and she would return to the straightforward life she had been living before the storm, and it would be enough because it had always been enough before. The schoolhouse and the students and the wide New Mexico sky were enough. They were everything. She told herself this 4 times that evening while grading composition papers, and it only worked intermittently. On the evening of the 23rd of April, 2 days before he planned to leave, there was a problem with the mare in the second stall, a low-grade colic that needed walking out and monitoring. Susanna went to the barn at dusk to check on the situation and found Paul already up and walking the horse in slow, patient circles, talking to her quietly in the way she had noticed he talked to all animals, without condescension, and with the genuine respect of someone who understood that other creatures had inner lives. She watched him for a moment from the doorway without announcing herself. He moved with the mare in the diminishing light with a patience that had nothing performative in it, just the simple concentration of a man focused on a living thing that needed attention. The mare had settled. Her ears were soft. Whatever colic tension she'd had in her body was working its way out under his steady management. Susanna had spent 7 months in a town full of people, and she had been genuinely alone in a way she had not let herself fully examine. and standing in the doorway of her own barn watching this man tend to her sick horse with a quietness that cost him nothing, she felt the particular recognition of a person who has found someone who takes up space in the world the way she takes up space in the world, not identically, but compatibly, in the way of two instruments that create something new when they play together. "She's better," he said without looking up. He had known she was there the whole time. "You're good with horses," she said. "Worked on ranches for 3 years. You get good with horses or you don't last." She walked in and took the mare's other side, and they walked the horse together in slow circles in the dim barn, and they talked. Not about logistics, not about Calhoun or Albuquerque or the Pinkerton men. They talked about small things, the kind of small things that are actually enormous, the books they had read, the meals they missed from childhood, what they believed about the afterlife, the sound of different kinds of rain. She told him about a winter in Columbus when she had been 17 and had climbed out onto the roof of her family's house at midnight to watch a meteor shower, and had come back in with ice in her hair and her mother furious, and the certainty that the world was bigger and stranger and more beautiful than the life being arranged around her. He told her about a summer evening in Tennessee when he was 14 and had sat on the porch with his father, who was already sick with the lung illness that would take him in the spring, and his father had said, "Paul, the only thing I know for certain is that the way you treat people when no one is watching is who you actually are." He said he had thought about those words every day since and had spent an embarrassing portion of his adult life failing them and had been trying to earn them back for 3 years. The mare was fully settled. They had stopped walking. They were standing in the middle of the barn in the last of the dim light with the horse between them and about 2 feet of space, and Susanna could feel the shape of the moment with a precision that was almost uncomfortable. Paul looked at her. She looked at him. "I'm not sorry you were in my barn," she said. "I'm not sorry either." He said it quietly but with a directness that was characteristic of him. No decoration, just the truth placed plainly in the air. "I'm sorry for what it's cost you. It hasn't cost me yet. It might. Most things worth anything cost something eventually." He was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, with the particular deliberateness of a man who makes considered choices, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, his fingers just barely grazing her cheek, and the touch was so careful and so restrained and so electric that she understood it as a complete sentence. She reached up and held his hand against her cheek for one moment. Just one. Then she stepped back because she was a practical woman, and the situation was what it was, and wanting something did not always mean it was the right time for it. 2 more days, she said, and went to the house. She did not sleep at all that night. The next day passed with the long, suspended quality of time that is running out. She taught her students in the morning, and they parsed sentences and worked multiplication problems, and Maria Vega read aloud from a book about the history of the territory with the fluid ease of someone for whom reading was as natural as breathing. And Susanna watched all of it with a kind of heightened attention, the way you notice the particular beauty of something when you know a change is coming. She brought Paul his dinner in the evening. They ate together in the barn, which had become a habit, sitting on opposite hay bales with the food between them, and she told him about Maria Vega's reading, and he said he'd like to meet her someday, and then they both felt the weight of the word someday, and neither of them said anything else about it. "I'll leave before first light," he said. "It's safer." "I know." "Susanna, don't," she said, and her voice was steady because she was working very hard to make it so. "Don't say anything that needs to be unsaid later." He looked at her. "What if I don't plan to unsay it?" The question sat in the warm barn air. The horses were quiet. The desert night was pressing soft against the walls. "You don't know what tomorrow looks like," she said. "You don't know if the road to Albuquerque is safe, or if Carver's plan is going to work, or what the law is going to do with what you give them. You don't know where you'll be in 6 months." "No," he agreed, "but I know where you'll be." She looked at him for a long time, and then she said very carefully, "Yes, I will be here." He left before dawn, as promised, while the sky was still the dark blue of deep night, and the stars were doing their ancient, indifferent work overhead. She heard him saddle his horse in the quiet of the barn, the familiar sounds of someone preparing to travel, and she stood at her kitchen window and watched the dark yard and did not go out. He did leave one thing. In the space where his hay bale bed had been, he left a folded piece of paper with her name on it. She picked it up at first light, unfolded it. He had written, "I will find a way to come back to you, not as what I have been, as what I'm trying to become, if you'll have it." She held the paper for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in the box on her dresser where she kept her most important things, her teaching certificate and her mother's cameo brooch, and the first letter from the Dustfall School Board offering her the position. And she went and made coffee and prepared to go to school. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that things are quiet after a storm has moved through, the air still carrying the charge of what had passed, but the sky emptied out and clear. She taught her students. She tended her kitchen garden. She corresponded with Maria Vega's father about the question of Maria's continued education, a negotiation that required patience and respect, and the willingness to understand that what the Vega family needed was not persuasion but partnership. She attended Sunday service and had dinners with Mrs. Whitmore and Deputy Brecker, and the handful of townspeople who had become her social world. She did not tell anyone about Paul Weston. She kept his secret not because she had promised to, though she had, and not precisely because she was afraid of the consequences, though she was, but because the secret felt like the last shape of something she was still inside, and she wasn't ready to be outside it yet. 3 weeks after he left, a letter came. It came addressed to Miss S. Hadley, Dustfall, New Mexico Territory. In handwriting she recognized immediately, the tall, careful letters of a man who had not had much formal schooling, but had taught himself to write with a precision that reflected the same quality of attention he brought to everything. He wrote, "I reached Albuquerque safely. Carver received me and we have had 3 meetings now. He believes the case against Calhoun is strong and that the territory will deal fairly with men who come forward voluntarily. He is filing papers next week. The process will take time. I am working in the meantime at a freight operation south of the city, honest work, good wages. I think about the barn every day. I think about what you said, that there is room here to be something still becoming. I am trying to become something that deserves to come back. I want you to know that, if it is permitted to want it," she wrote back. She wrote back the same evening, which was not what she had planned, having planned to wait at least 3 days to avoid the appearance of eagerness. But the eagerness was not something she was able to suppress once she held the letter and felt its weight. She wrote about her students and about the kitchen garden, and about the way the desert had gone from brown to green with the spring rain. She wrote about Mrs. Whitmore's new batch of apple preserves and Deputy Brecker's ongoing dispute with the saloon owner over a property line. She wrote about the small, ongoing texture of a life in a place she loved. She wrote, at the end, "I want it to be permitted too." They wrote to each other for 6 weeks. Letters that came with the reliability of something you stop noticing until it's gone. That particular relief of seeing a familiar handwriting on an envelope at the post office. The pleasure of sitting down with a cup of coffee to read words that felt specifically and only for her. He wrote about Carver's progress, which was slow and maddening in the way of all legal processes. He wrote about the freight work, loading and driving supply wagons to the mining settlements south of Albuquerque, which he found satisfying in the honest, uncomplicated way of physical work that produces something real. He wrote about a man he had met at the freight company, a former soldier named Augusto Guerrero who had a wife and 3 children, and who invited Paul to dinner on Sundays, and whose family's straightforward warmth had reminded him. He wrote that ordinary human happiness was a real thing that real people achieved, not a story told to keep people obedient. She read that line 3 times. She was reading his most recent letter on the morning of the day that everything collapsed, sitting at her kitchen table with the coffee going cold beside her, when she heard horses coming down the main road at a pace that meant urgency. She put the letter in her apron pocket and went to the window. Sheriff Dale Harrow. He had ridden from Mesilla with 2 deputies, which meant something significant, and he was headed toward the general store, which was where the town gathered for anything important. She felt the cold move through her before she knew the reason for it. She found out the reason within the hour, because in a town of 200 people information is nearly as fast as light. Sheriff Harrow had received a telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office in Santa Fe. A Pinkerton agent named Price had filed a report stating that he had spoken to residents of Dustfall in late April about a wanted man named Paul Weston, and that he had reason to believe that at least one resident had lied to him in the course of that inquiry. Further, a man named Price had identified Susanna Hadley by name as the most likely person to have had knowledge of Weston's whereabouts, based on the pattern of inquiry and certain observed behaviors that he had included in his report. The Territorial Marshal wanted Harrow to question her. Harrow, who was thorough and fair and not prone to assumption but also not prone to letting things go, rode to her house first. She was there. She opened the door before he knocked because she had been watching through the window. "Miss Hadley," he said, hat in hand, which was the only indication that what he was about to do was something he wasn't entirely comfortable with. "I know why you're here," she said. "Come in." She gave him coffee because it was what you did. They sat at the kitchen table she ate at every morning, and she answered his questions as carefully and as honestly as she could manage, which meant that she told him nothing directly and misdirected skillfully, and felt the specific guilt of a person who has decided that a law and a justice are not the same thing, and is now paying the price of that decision in a kitchen with a decent man who deserves better. Harrow was too good at his job. He thanked her and left. 2 hours later he came back with both his deputies and a request, politely phrased but clearly not optional, that she accompany him to the general store, which was where the town was assembled, which was where Paul Weston was, which she had not known, which was the largest shock of all, the door opening and seeing him standing in the center of the general store in his road clothes, both hands visible, perfectly still, with Harrow's revolver already out and coming up. He had come back. He had not told her he was coming. She understood why later. He had not known exactly when the legal matter would reach a point where returning was possible, and he had not wanted to give her expectation that might be crushed if things went wrong. He had come as soon as Carver told him the Territorial Marshal's office had agreed to his terms, voluntary surrender and testimony in exchange for formal consideration of his cooperation, and he had ridden to Dustfall first because Dustfall was where she was. He had ridden into town that morning. He had ridden directly into a sheriff's questioning. Harrow had identified him from the Pinkerton description the moment he dismounted. And now Paul Weston stood with a gun to his head and his eyes on Susanna Hadley, and she understood the full architecture of everything that had brought them both to this moment. Every choice and every secret, and every letter and every morning she had brought food to a barn, and every night she had lain awake composing things she wanted to say in the next letter. All of it collapsed down to this single burning point where the only question was what she was going to do. "Miss Hadley," Sheriff Harrow said, "was this man in your barn on the night of April 12th? The whole room waited. Paul's eyes on hers, steady, not asking anything, not asking her to lie, not asking her to save him, just looking at her the way he always looked at her, like she was real and specific and entirely herself. And she understood, in that moment, that she didn't need to keep his secret anymore. Not because she had decided to betray him, but because the secret no longer served the purpose it had been kept for. Paul Weston was standing in this room because he had chosen to stand here. He had surrendered voluntarily. He had Carver's legal arrangement in his coat pocket. He had come back to Dustfall not running but walking in open daylight because he had stopped being a man who ran. The secret had been to protect him while he found his way to this moment. He had found it. She looked at Sheriff Harrow. "Yes," she said, "he was." A sound moved through the room. He was in my barn because he was shot and it was a storm, and whatever he had been before, he was a hurt man in my barn. And the moment he could ride safely, he left. He was never a danger to anyone in this town. And if you check with an attorney named Carver in Albuquerque, you'll find that he has already made arrangements with the Territorial Marshal's office to cooperate with the prosecution of the Calhoun gang, which is still active and still violent, and that his voluntary surrender was always the plan. Harrow looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Paul. "Is this true?" he asked. "All of it," Paul said. His voice was as steady as it always was. "I have the documentation in my inside coat pocket if you'll permit me to reach for it." Harrow lowered the revolver slightly. Slowly, Paul reached into his coat and produced the folded documents that Carver had prepared, the agreement with the marshal's office, the summary of his voluntary cooperation terms, the letter from the Albuquerque legal office. He handed them to Harrow. Harrow read them. He read them carefully. The room was so quiet you could hear the horses outside. When he looked up, his face had shifted in a way that was not quite concession but was close to it. "I'll need to verify this with the marshal's office," he said. "Of course," Paul said. "In the meantime, you'll stay in Dustfall under my authority, not locked up under your word." "You have it." Harrow looked at Susanna. "Miss Hadley, you and I are going to have a longer conversation about your conduct during Mr. Weston's time in your barn." "I know," she said. The room began to breathe again. People shifted and murmured, and the particular electricity of a resolved confrontation moved through the crowd like a change in weather. People began to leave the general store in ones and twos, and the ones who stayed did so with the self-consciousness of people who have witnessed something they will spend years deciding how to tell. Susanna walked toward Paul through the thinning crowd. He watched her come. She stopped 2 feet from him. Her heart was doing something vigorous and largely unmanaged in her chest. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would. You said you'd find a way. I didn't know you meant today." "I didn't know either," he said. "Until I was on the road south, and I knew the papers were in order and there was nothing between me and Dustfall except miles, and I thought, why would I go anywhere else first?" She looked at him. This tall, complicated, careful man who had slept in her barn and eaten her food and read her letters and ridden back to a town where the law was looking for him because this was where she was. "You could have been arrested before I got to say anything," she said. "I know. That was a risk." "Yes." "Did you think about that when you were deciding to ride here first?" "Yes," he said, "and I came anyway." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the general store was emptying out, and the afternoon light was coming through the big front windows and falling across the rough plank floor, and somewhere outside someone was hammering something with the cheerful, unconcerned industriousness of a person who had a task to complete and was completing it. "Well," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, "you can't stay in the barn this time." Something that had been tightly held in his face released. It wasn't quite a smile yet, but it was everything that precedes one. "No, no," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore has a room." He looked at her. She looked at him. "All right," he said. The verification came back from the Territorial Marshal's office in Santa Fe 5 days later. The telegram to Sheriff Harrow confirmed that Paul Weston had indeed entered into a voluntary cooperation arrangement with the office, that his information regarding the Calhoun operation had been received and was being acted upon, and that the terms of his cooperation included a formal suspended sentence contingent on his testimony before the Territory's court when the Calhoun case was brought to trial, which was expected within the year. Harrow came to tell Susanna himself. "He stays in Dustfall for now," Harrow said, sitting at her kitchen table for the second time in a week, and she noticed that this time he seemed more comfortable, the way people are comfortable when the story has resolved in a direction they can accept. "He's free to move about. He'll need to remain available for the court when the time comes. The marshal's office has agreed to the terms." "And me?" she asked. "My conduct during his time here." Harrow regarded her with the expression of a man who has concluded something. "The marshal's office is prepared to view your assistance to a man who has since voluntarily surrendered and cooperated as a matter that does not require further action," he said carefully, particularly given that you yourself provided honest testimony once directly questioned. Not the first time, she said, because she was honest about her own record. No, Harrow agreed. But the second time when it mattered in a room full of witnesses, you did. That counts for something. She thanked him. He left. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and breathed out very slowly. Then she put on her coat and walked to Mrs. Whitmore's boarding house. Paul was in the small front parlor that Mrs. Whitmore used for guests, sitting with a coffee cup that she recognized as part of Mrs. Whitmore's good china, which meant the widow had assessed him and found him acceptable, which was not a small thing. He stood up when Susanna came in. She told him what Harrow had said. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished he sat back down and looked at the floor for a moment in the way she had come to understand meant he was processing something significant. Suspended sentence, he said, pending testimony. Yes. And then it's resolved, she said. You'll have a clean record. Or close enough to one that the law won't be chasing you. He looked up at her. Something very quiet and very large was in his expression. I've been running for 3 years, he said. I know. I don't know what I look like standing still. Well, she said, and she sat down in the chair across from him, which was a small yellow chair with carved legs that Mrs. Whitmore had gotten from somewhere, and she settled into it and looked at him directly the way she always looked at him, without decoration, just clearly. You look like yourself. I think that's probably enough to start with. He looked at her for a long time. I want to court you properly, he said, if you'll allow it. I know that's not a straightforward proposition given everything. Nothing worth anything is straightforward, she said. No, he agreed, but I want to do it right. I want to call on you at proper hours and meet you after church and walk with you in front of the whole town. I want there to be nothing hidden about it. She felt something warm move through her chest. No more secrets, she said. No more secrets. She nodded once, decisive, the way she made decisions. Then come to dinner on Saturday. 6 o'clock. And bring your appetite because I have finally gotten the hang of proper cornbread. He arrived at 5:55. Mrs. Whitmore, who knew everything that happened in Dustfall within approximately 45 minutes of its happening, told Susanna the next morning at the post office that it was a good thing Paul Weston seemed to be settling, and that she had always found the territorial courts too harsh on men whose worst actions were behind them. And she said this with the slight emphasis of a woman who wanted it, understood that she approved of the direction things were heading, and would say so plainly to anyone who asked. The people of Dustfall, who were a community in the real sense, meaning they were complicated and various and capable of both judgment and grace, had their own process with the news of Paul Weston's presence and history and current standing. There were those who were cautious. Frank Dobbins, who managed the general store in his family's absence, was cool toward Paul for several weeks, and the owner of the Silver Tongue Saloon expressed concern about a man with a criminal past being a resident, and these were legitimate concerns from people who had to live in the town, and whose worry Susanna respected even when she disagreed with it. But there were also those who watched and drew their own conclusions. Hector Vega, who had a long memory for faces and a longer one for character, said to Susanna one morning in the simplest possible terms, "A man is what he does now, not what he did before." And Mrs. Whitmore threw a dinner party in late May that included Paul and made it impossible for half the town's leading figures to maintain a cold position without being rude to Clara Whitmore, which no one in Dustfall was willing to be. And Deputy Brecker, who had worked with enough reformed men to know what the real thing looked like, shook Paul's hand one afternoon and said nothing beyond that, but the handshake said plenty. Paul found work at the livery stable. Hector Vega, who Susanna suspected had understood more about what had been happening in her barn than he had let on at the time, offered Paul a position as his assistant with the same quiet pragmatism he brought to everything, and Paul accepted with genuine gratitude and settled into the work with the reliability that Hector valued above most other qualities in an employee. He was good with the horses. Everyone noticed it. There was something in the way he handled frightened animals, patient without being passive, steady without being forceful, that earned him a reputation faster than words could have. Ranchers who brought horses in for shoeing started requesting that Paul handle the difficult ones, and he did it without drama or self-advertisement, just the quiet competence of someone who has found work that suits him. He called on Susanna every Saturday for dinner. He walked her home from church on Sundays, which in dustfall was a statement legible to everyone who cared to read it. They walked together in the evenings along the edge of town, where the land opened up toward the foothills and the sky did its impossible things. She told him about her week at school. He told her about his week at the livery. They talked about the letter she had received from the Columbus School Board, who had heard of her work in Dustfall through some connection with the Territorial Education Office, and were curious about her methods. They talked about the books he was reading. He had discovered the public lending library maintained by Mrs. Whitmore, and was working his way through it with the appetite of a man making up for lost time. She told him one evening about her father's opinion that she would not last a winter in New Mexico. He told her about a conversation he'd had with me, his sister, to whom he had written for the first time in 6 years. The letter had come back brief and guarded, but it had come back, and that was more than he had expected. "That's something," Susanna said. "It's something," he agreed. "She has children now, 3 of them. I'm an uncle to people who don't know I exist. They might, someday, when there's less explaining required." She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the fence rail, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stood like that in the late evening light, while the mountains to the north went from gold to purple to the particular gray-blue of desert twilight. And neither of them said anything because the moment was full enough without words. In July, she asked him to come to school. Not formally, not as a lesson, just to come and see. She had told her students about him in the circumspect way of a teacher sharing something real without creating unnecessary complication, describing him simply as a friend who knew a great deal about horses and about the territory. And the students had been curious in the forthright way of children who haven't yet learned to disguise their interest. He came on a Thursday morning and stood at the front of the small schoolhouse with the 12 children watching him and the afternoon light coming through the windows and Susanna at her desk watching him with a different quality of attention. And he talked about the territory, about the cattle trails and the geography of the region, and what the land had looked like before the settlement spread. He spoke with a natural clarity, not lecturing, just telling, the way of someone who has observed a thing closely and can describe what he saw. Maria Vega asked him 3 precise and penetrating questions that made him laugh with genuine delight, and afterward he told Susanna that Maria was the sharpest mind he had encountered in the territory, and would she please not give up on the question of her continuing education. "I have no intention of it," Susanna said. "Good." He was still smiling from Maria's questions. It was the kind of smile that changed his whole face, open and unguarded, the version of him that appeared when he had forgotten for a moment to be careful. She loved that smile with the particular intensity of someone who knows they are seeing something rare. She loved him. She had known it for some time, but she acknowledged it to herself completely that afternoon, watching him shake hands with an 11-year-old girl who asked sharper questions than most adults, and the acknowledgement moved through her not as a shock, but as the recognition of something that had been true for a while and was simply being named. She did not say it to him yet. It was August before she said it. They were at the kitchen table of her house, late in the evening after dinner, the dishes pushed aside, and a lamp between them and the August heat still pressing at the windows even after dark. She had been rereading one of his earlier letters, which she did sometimes, taking them from the box on her dresser and reading them in sequence to follow the arc of what had been building between them through those weeks of correspondence. "What are you reading?" he asked. She showed him. The letter from May, the one about Augusto Guerrero's family and the Sunday dinners. He looked at it for a moment. "I wrote that a long time ago." You said that ordinary human happiness was a real thing that real people achieved. I remember. I've been thinking about that, she said, about whether I believe it. Do you? She looked at him across the lamp. I'm starting to, she said, with some evidence. And then, because she was not a woman who left things unsaid when they needed saying, I love you, Paul. He was very still. I'm not saying it to ask anything of you, she continued, her voice steady, because she had thought about how to say this and had decided that the version without condition was the honest one. I'm saying it because it's true and you deserve to know what's true. He reached across the table and took her hand. I love you, he said, simply and completely, with the directness that was his particular form of honesty. I have been in love with you since you walked into a barn with a pitchfork and a medical tin, and decided to be someone I hadn't known existed. She laughed, which was not what she had expected to do at this moment, but the image of herself with a pitchfork caught her and he laughed too, and the laughter broke whatever last tension had been held in the room. And when they were done laughing, she was holding his hand in both of hers across the kitchen table, and the lamp was warm between them, and the August night was pressing at the windows, and she thought, this is what it feels like to be somewhere. He proposed in September. He did it without ceremony, which was to say with all the ceremony that was natural to him, which was to say he asked her directly and without performance on the back step of her house one evening while they were looking at the stars, which in the New Mexico territory were a thing of serious consequence, the altitude and the dry air making them visible in their thousands, the Milky Way laid across the sky like a river of light. He said, I want to marry you, Susanna. Not because I feel I owe you something, and not out of any other reason than that I want to be where you are for the rest of my life, and I think I can be a good husband to you. I think I know enough about what matters to do it right, but I need to know if that's what you want, not because of me, but because of your own life and what you want it to be. She turned to look at him. Yes, she said. Yes, you want to marry me. Yes, she said again firmly, with the decisive quality that was as much a part of her as the color of her eyes. That is exactly what I want, my own life and what I want it to be. He held her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, carefully, thoroughly, with the same quality of full attention he brought to everything. And the stars continued doing their indifferent ancient work overhead, and neither of them noticed, because they had enough light of their own. They told Mrs. Whitmore first, because it would be unkind not to, and Mrs. Whitmore wept with the uncomplicated joy of a woman who loves a love story and had been tracking this one closely. And then she dried her eyes and started talking about the dinner. She was going to throw in their honor before Susanna had even finished the sentence. They told Hector Vega, who nodded once and said, good, with the complete economy of a man who had already concluded this was coming and had no further commentary to add. They told Deputy Brecker at the post office, and he shook Paul's hand again with the same wordless directness as before. And then he shook Susanna's hand too, which she appreciated. They told the students the next morning at school, and the children received the news with a range of responses that included Maria Vega saying she had anticipated this outcome 2 months ago, and a 6-year-old boy named Tommy Marsh who promptly asked if this meant there would be cake. Yes, Susanna told him. There will definitely be cake. The Calhoun trial was held in Mesilla in November. Paul rode to the county seat with Sheriff Harrow and spent 3 days testifying before the territorial court. Susanna did not go. She stayed in Dustfall and taught school and read the letters he sent from Mesilla, which described the courtroom and the lawyers and the strange detached feeling of watching the events of 3 years ago become official history. He wrote about seeing Calhoun across the courtroom, the man he had once followed and had stopped following, and how Calhoun looked diminished now, smaller than memory had made him, the way dangerous things often look when you face them in daylight without running. He wrote, I think I understand now what my father meant. The way you treat people when no one is watching is who you actually are. I was not that person for a while. I have been trying to be that person for 3 years. Standing in this courtroom, I think for the first time that I might actually be getting there. She wrote back the same evening. You have been that person since the night you sat in my barn and said you knew what you were asking, and you were asking it anyway because you had no one else. That is a man who understands what asking costs. That is a man who knows the weight of a request. I have known who you are for a long time. I am glad you are starting to know it too. He came home on a Thursday evening with the trial concluded and Calhoun sentenced, and the suspended sentence formally lifted from his record. She met him at the edge of town because she could not quite manage to wait at the house, which she would have blamed on practical reasons if anyone had asked, but which was in fact purely because she needed to see him the moment he returned, needed to see him with the particular relief of a person whose held breath has finally been released. He rode in and saw her standing at the edge of the road with her coat and her hair coming loose from its pins in the evening wind, and he dismounted before the horse had quite stopped. And she walked forward to meet him, and he took her hands, and they stood in the middle of the road while the evening moved around them, and she felt the specific reality of him, solid and present and here, with no more running ahead and no more secrets behind. It's done, he said. It's done, she confirmed. All of it. All of it, she said. And then she pulled him toward her and kissed him there in the road in front of whatever Dustfall wanted to make of it. And Paul made a sound that was half surprise and half laughter and kissed her back thoroughly. They were married on the 14th of December, 1883, in Dustfall's church, which was the same building where the circuit court convened, which Susanna privately thought was fitting. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony with the warmth of a man who enjoyed this particular function of his role considerably. Mrs. Whitmore had organized the decorations, pine branches and candles, and a generous arrangement of dried wildflowers that she had been collecting since October. Hector Vega sat in the front row with Maria and the rest of his family. Deputy Brecker stood to Paul's left because there was no one else, and because it turned out that standing quietly at a man's side was something Saul Brecker was naturally suited for. 14 students occupied the middle rows with their families, and Tommy Marsh spent most of the ceremony watching the cake table at the back of the room. Susanna wore a dress the blue-gray color of the desert sky just before full dark, which she had made herself from fabric ordered from Santa Fe, and she carried dried larkspur that Maria had picked and dried because Maria had decided she was going to be part of this ceremony, whether she had been officially assigned a role or not. Paul wore the best clothes he owned, which were not elaborate but were clean and carefully pressed, and he stood at the altar with the specific stillness that she knew meant he was feeling something very large. And when she walked toward him, she watched his face make the complete and unguarded movement from composed to overwhelmed and back to composed. And she loved him so much in that moment that the church and the witnesses and the December cold all went slightly distant. He held her hands and said the words the Reverend prompted him with, and then said additional things the Reverend had not prompted him with, which was characteristic. He said, "You walked into a barn in a storm and you decided I was worth something before I had given you a single reason to. I have been trying to earn that decision every day since. I plan to spend whatever time I'm given continuing to earn it." She said her own vows, and then, because she was not a woman who left things at half measure, "You asked me to keep a secret once. I kept it as long as you needed me to. And then you stopped needing me to keep it because you stopped being what you were hiding. That's the man I'm marrying, the one who made that journey. I plan to walk the rest of it beside you." Mrs. Whitmore was crying openly. Maria Vega was writing something in a small notebook that she carried everywhere. Tommy Marsh was watching the cake. Paul Weston kissed his wife in front of God and the town of Dustfall and the particular clear winter light of the New Mexico territory, and held her like something he had been looking for a long time and had found. The first year of their marriage had the quality of something both simple and extraordinary, the way deep contentment always does, the way it takes the ordinary and makes it luminous simply by being present in it. They lived in the Hadley house, which everyone now called the Weston place, and Paul added a room to the back of it in the spring using skills he had picked up on the ranches, measuring and cutting and raising boards with the focused satisfaction of a man building something that belongs to him. She kept teaching. The school board had raised the question, in their slightly awkward way, of whether a married woman's position at the school was appropriate to maintain, and she had looked at the three men on the board with the particular expression she reserved for arguments she found intellectually insulting, and had explained that her marital status had no bearing on her ability to teach mathematics and reading and composition to the children of Dustfall, and that if the board disagreed, she would be happy to let them explain to the families of 14 students why their schoolhouse was closing. The board found, upon reflection, that they agreed with her. Paul continued at the livery. Hector Vega, whose age was catching up with his ambitions, had begun talking about the future of the business in a way that involved Paul's name in increasingly specific terms. By the summer of 1884, the conversation had progressed to the point where it was clear that Hector intended to offer Paul a partnership in the livery, and Paul had begun to save money toward the purchase of his share. Me wrote in April. A longer letter this time, more open, asking questions about New Mexico and about Susanna and about Paul's work. She mentioned that her husband, a man named Robert Yates, was a reasonable man and that she thought, if Paul was willing, a visit might be possible at some point. The letter took him a long time to write back to. Susanna sat with him while he wrote it, not helping with the words but present, which was what was needed. Maria Vega's father agreed in March of 1884 to allow Maria to continue her schooling and to correspond with the sisters at the Catholic girls' school in Santa Fe about the possibility of Maria attending. This was not a small concession from a man who had his reasons for caution about the Anglo-dominated institutions of the territory, and Susanna understood those reasons and had spent months in dialogue with him that went well beyond what most teachers would have considered their professional obligation, learning enough of the family's history and concerns to be a genuine partner in the decision rather than simply a persuader. The agreement was celebrated quietly, in the way the best victories always are. A dinner at the Vega house where Susanna and Paul sat at a table crowded with 3 generations and ate food she had never had before and understood for the 100th time that she had come to exactly the right place. She was pregnant by July of 1884, which she discovered with the mixture of joy and terror that was the appropriate response to such news in 1884. When the stakes of childbearing were fully understood by every woman in a frontier town. She told Paul on a Sunday evening, and he sat very still for a moment and then looked at her with an expression so entirely open that she felt she was seeing all the way to the center of him. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He laughed, which was the sound she loved best from him, the full, unguarded version of it. "I don't have a word for what I am," he said. "Happy," she suggested. "Somewhere past that," he said. Mrs. Whitmore organized the preparation with the efficiency of a woman who had been the first call for every significant event in Dustfall for 20 years. She assembled the women who knew what needed knowing and made sure Susanna knew it, and she appointed herself the principal support person for the birth with a decisiveness that Susanna accepted with the gratitude it deserved. Their son was born in February of 1885, in the blue and gray cold of a New Mexico winter morning, and they named him James after Paul's father. James Arthur Weston, 7 pounds and some change, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw already evident in the set of his small face. Paul held him in the first hour of his life with the same quality of careful, complete attention that he brought to everything, and his face was entirely undone by it in the way that only the particular love of a parent in the first moments of their child's life can undo a person, and Susanna watched this from her pillow and felt the fullness of the thing they had built filling the room until there was no space left for anything but it. Hector Vega came to see the baby, and said he had a fine head for a child, and that he expected he would be good with horses. Mrs. Whitmore held James for 20 minutes and cried without apology. Maria Vega, who was 14 now and preparing her application for the Santa Fe school, came and sat quietly beside the baby and then wrote something in her notebook again. And when Susanna asked what she was writing, Maria showed her a sentence. "He has the kind of face that already knows something." Susanna kept that sentence for the rest of her life. By the summer of 1885, the livery partnership was formalized. Paul became a co-owner of the Vega and Weston livery, which was what the painted sign on the building said, and Hector retained his partnership with the satisfaction of a man who had arranged something correctly and would not need to worry about it further. The business expanded to include a small farrier operation and a horse trading post, and Paul's reputation for skill with difficult horses brought customers from as far as Mesilla and Las Cruces, ranchers who had heard from other ranchers about the tall, quiet man in Dustfall who could settle a frightened animal with a patience that defied explanation. Mee Yates and her husband Robert visited in the fall of 1885, and it was neither as easy nor as difficult as Paul had feared. Mee was a small woman who looked like him around the eyes and who watched him carefully across the first dinner as though she was taking measurements, and then gradually, over the 3 days of the visit, settled into something more open, more like the sister she had been when they were children before the war took their father, and the distance took everything else. She held James and said he had Paul's hands, which was true. She and Susanna sat on the back step one evening while Paul and Robert talked about cattle farming, and Mee said, in the direct way that was apparently a family characteristic, "You're good for him." The kind of person who sees what's actually there rather than what they expect to see. "He makes it easy," Susanna said honestly. Mee looked at her. "He wasn't always easy to see," she said. "I know," Susanna said, "but he was always there to see." The Calhoun gang was fully dismantled by late 1885. The Territorial Marshal's office sent a formal notification to Paul that included the phrase "complete and satisfactory cooperation," and which he read once and then put in the same box where Susanna kept her most important things, next to his note from the barn that she had kept all this time, the one that said, "I will find a way to come back to you." He found it, she thought each time she opened that box. He found it and he came back and he stopped needing to be hidden and he stopped needing to run and he stopped needing any of the darkness that had preceded him. And what was left, what had always been left under all of it, was this. This house with the added room and the kitchen garden and the barn where a sick horse still occasionally needed walking. This town with its 200 souls and its complicated grace. These students, including a new batch that came to the schoolhouse each year, and Maria Vega, who had gone to Santa Fe and written back every month, and whose letters grew more extraordinary with each one. This man, who had asked her to keep a secret she had kept long enough for him to stop needing her to, and who stood in the livery yard on a September evening in 1885 with their son on his shoulders, and the horses moving in their quiet, complicated way around him, and who looked up when she walked toward him with the same expression he had given her in the lamplight of a barn 2 years ago, adjusted now by time and certainty, but still containing the essential thing. The specific recognition of a person who has found what he was looking for and knows precisely what it is. She walked toward him through the September evening. James saw her coming and reached his arms down toward her from his perch on Paul's shoulders and made the incoherent, demanding sound of a toddler who has decided it is time to be held by his mother. Paul steadied him and reached for Susanna's hand as she came close. "Good day," he asked. "Very good," she said. Maria's letter came. She won a prize for an essay. What was it about? The territory, she said, and what it means to belong to a place that is still becoming. He smiled, the full, unguarded version. "She learned that," he said. "From a teacher who learned it," Susanna said, "from a man in a barn in a storm." He brought her hand to his mouth, kissed her knuckles. James, unsatisfied with being ignored, grabbed a fistful of Paul's hair, which was becoming a habit. They walked home through the September evening, through the town that had seen their secrets and their honesty and their becoming, through the light that fell across the high desert in the particular way that had made her stay. And the mountains stood in the north like they always had, permanent and patient, and the sky did its impossible things. And Susanna Hadley, who was now Susanna Weston, walked into the warmth of her own house with her husband and her son and thought, with the complete and satisfied certainty of a woman who has arrived exactly where she was going, that there was nowhere else she could possibly be. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara for Mrs. Whitmore, arrived in 1887. James was 2 years old and considered her arrival with the serious skepticism of a person who had not been consulted. Paul held Clara in the first morning of her life with the same undone quality of attention he had given James, the capacity for this kind of complete presence being one of the things she loved most about him. And Mrs. Whitmore, for whom the baby was named and who had been told the night before, arrived at 7 in the morning with cornbread and her best china, and an expression of joy so complete it required no further elaboration. The years moved through them the way good years do, not slowly and not quickly, but with the particular quality of time that is being lived rather than waded through. Dustfall grew. A railroad spur reached the valley in 1888 and brought new families and new commerce and the complications that came with change. And Susanna served on the school board herself by 1890, one of the first women to do so, which was a fight she won with the same combination of patience and absolute immovability that she brought to all important things. Paul's partnership in the livery expanded into a full horse trading and training operation that reached customers across the territory, and his reputation was such that, when the territorial government commissioned the selection of horses for the Albuquerque Constabulary in 1890, they sent the request to him. He accepted it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has found the exact life that fits him. Me and Robert Yates visited again in 1889, and this time it was easier, and me held Clara and told James stories about his father as a boy in Tennessee, and Paul sat in the kitchen while she did it with the expression of a man in the process of recovering something he thought he had lost for good. Maria Vega came back to Dustfall in 1891, a teacher herself now, trained in Santa Fe and hired by the new school district that had formed with the town's growth. She and Susanna taught together for 2 years before Maria took a position in Albuquerque, and the goodbye was the kind that doesn't feel like goodbye, because the connection is too real to require presence to maintain it. In the winter of 1893, 10 years after the storm and the barn and the pitchfork and the beginning of everything, Susanna and Paul sat on the back step of their house in the evening, which was a habit they had maintained through every season, the particular end-of-day ritual of two people who enjoy each other's company enough to want to be in it, even when there is nothing specific to talk about. James was 10 years old and asleep inside, currently obsessed with horses in the specific way of a child whose father's livery meant he had been around them since birth and who had recently decided he was going to train horses when he grew up, a decision no one in the Weston household was surprised by. Clara was 6 and asleep beside her brother, and had opinions about nearly everything and was, as Mrs. Whitmore said with deep satisfaction, exactly like her mother. Paul had a cup of coffee. Susanna had a cup of the mint tea she had grown to prefer in the evenings. The night was cold and clear in the way of New Mexico in December, the stars doing their ancient work. "You remember," she said, "what you said in your first letter, that you thought about the barn every day." "Yes, do you still?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking genuinely. "Not the barn specifically," he said. "What it was." "What it was," she repeated. "The first night I felt like I could stop," he said. "Stop running, stop being what I'd been. Someone told me I was worth something when I hadn't earned it yet. That's what I think about." She looked at the stars. "You had earned it," she said. "You had been earning it for 3 years. You just hadn't been told yet." He reached over and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat in the December night while the house behind them held the sleeping weight of their children, and the town around them held the accumulated years of a life built in the full view of people who had seen all of it and claimed it as their own. "No more secrets," he said. "No more secrets," she confirmed. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He brought her hand to his chest, covered it with both of his. The stars were infinite and indifferent, and the desert was cold and clear, and the mountains stood north in the dark where they had always stood, permanent as the things that matter. And Susanna Weston sat in the life she had chosen and had been chosen into and felt, with the certainty of 10 years and 2 children and 100 seasons of this exact kind of evening, that she was entirely, completely, undeniably home.